someone. My lord, your time has come right between the eyes. Felled his master not by chance, away with pomp and circumstance. Come join our merry dance to the rhythm of goodbye. Farewell the jewel crown, farewell the velvet gown. Watch it all come tumbling down. Goodbye to the crown. Goodbye to the crown. Goodbye to the king of nothing really. Wave of a hand and a life of Riley. Pot Nazi, Pod King Billy. Goodbye to the crown. Goodbye to the dear old mum, mummified on gin and rum. Smile and wave and just play dumb. Goodbye to the crown. Farewell the jewel crown, farewell the velvet gown. Watch it all come tumbling down. Goodbye to the crown. Goodbye to the crown.
Hello there, and welcome to another edition of The Monarchy with me, Samson Sees, here on Press TV. We are proud to give you another look at Britain with this programme. It's the stuff that you won't normally find on mainstream media networks. But one event's actually making news headlines around the world. We are only a few days away from Scotland's referendum on independence from Britain, and Her Majesty appears to be a trifle worried. We will certainly keep updating you with the latest on that particular issue. Also in this episode, we will have a look at Britain and NATO's threatening stance on Russia. Check this out. As if Prime Minister David Cameron hasn't got enough problems, the promised referendum allowing Scotland to vote on whether people want independence from the rest of the United Kingdom looms ever closer. And some polls show that the gap between the yes and no camps is closing.
Probably not now.
To your left, actually.
Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron is in trouble with his own Conservative Party, with Tory MPs calling for a vote of no confidence for allowing the Scottish independence referendum to take place. Some Tory MPs believe Cameron is risking the future of the Union by agreeing to the independence vote.
Well, I'll do everything that I can, and let's be frank, there's a lot that the political leaders disagree about, but there's one thing we all agree about passionately, and that is that our United Kingdom is better off if we stay together. So tomorrow, the right place to be isn't in Westminster at Prime Minister's questions, it's being in Scotland, listening to people, talking to people. We'll all have our own ways, separately, of talking about why we're better together.
According to senior Conservative lawmakers, Cameron may face an immediate vote of no confidence if Scotland votes next week to break away from the Union. Analysts say that Cameron will face calls to quit before the 2015 general elections in the event of the Scottish independence. The developments come as a YouGov poll published on the 7th of September put pro-independence supporters in the lead for the first time with 51%, compared with the 49% in favour of remaining in the Union. The Unionists have been ahead in opinion polls for months, but their lead has recently narrowed. Last month, another YouGov poll showed that the No campaign had a 22-point lead.
I think it's a very significant day in the referendum campaign. I mean, this is the day that the No campaign finally fell apart at the seams. We now know, after all of the hype of the last 48 hours since they realised that the ground was shifting under their feet, there's actually nothing new in this package whatsoever. This is a retreading, a repackaging, a retimetaBling of what they said in the spring. Now, people are kind of past their verdict on what they said in the spring. It's totally inadequate, it's not enough. It's nothing approaching the powers that Scotland needs to create jobs, to save the health service and to build a better society. So this is the day that the No campaign finally fell apart at the seams.
The poll prompted former Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown to announce plans that would give Scotland greater autonomy if Scots voted no to independence.
This vote is not about whether Scotland is a nation. Scotland is already a nation. We were a nation yesterday, today, tomorrow, September the 19th. We're not voting on that, we are a nation. We are proposing, Joanne, the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, that over the next few months we agree a programme that the Scottish Parliament should have increased powers in welfare, in social and economic policy, and in finance. We are also proposing that there is a timetable for delivery.
Brown promised that plans to deliver the enhanced devolution to Scots would kick off the day after they vote to reject the referendum, with draft legislation on greater taxation and spending powers ready first next January. The former Prime Minister added that the planned measures are backed by the three main political parties in the British Parliament.
All the major pro-devolution parties at Westminster and at Holyrood have now told me they agree with this timetable. That means that when we return to Parliament in the second week of October, immediately we're back, I can say today, that there will be a motion in that Parliament to proceed with measures that will speed up the implementation of the powers that will be additional to the Scottish Parliament. And the process of bringing more powers to the Scottish Parliament will begin the day after the referendum. On September the 18th, if people vote no, they can be sure that September the 19th is the starting gun for bringing in further powers to the Parliament.
Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond responded to Brown's announcement, saying the promises are nothing new and instead show panic among the pro-unionists. He said the No campaign opposing Scottish independence is spiralling into self-destruction. He predicts that Scottish voters would dismiss the UK government pledge, as Osborne and Prime Minister David Cameron have no credibility on extra devolution, since they refuse to allow a second more powers question on the vote ballot paper.
Yes, I think it's counterproductive for their campaign, not because I say so or the Yes campaign says so, but because the reaction in the streets and communities of Scotland sees this as a last gasp piece of desperation from the Westminster establishment. And the Westminster establishment, I mean, they're not popular in England, never mind popular in Scotland. So yes, I think it's a boost for our campaign. But the crucial issue that we want to get onto is that this campaign, the broad-based Yes campaign, is concerned about having a powerhouse parliament to create and protect jobs in Scotland, a powerhouse parliament to protect our National Health Service. What the Westminster establishment seem to be concerned about, and their leaders, is protecting their own jobs. And that is the crucial contrast, and one of the reasons that Yes are gaining so much ground in this campaign, and the momentum is all with the Yes campaign.
The opposition Labour Party is also expected to have less chances of gaining a majority in the elections if it loses its 40 Scottish lawmakers. During an interview with the Scottish Daily, British Labour Party leader Ed Miliband said guards may be ordered to line the 95-mile English-Scottish border if the majority of Scottish people voted for independence in an upcoming referendum. Prior to the remarks by Miliband, his spokesman also said that Britain would be in charge of measures guaranteeing safety on their side of the border. British financial markets have stumbled after the recent poll. In reaction to a possible Scottish breakaway from the UK, the sterling fell by nearly 1% to $1.6, hitting the lowest level since last November. The pound also fell sharply against the Japanese yen to 169.68, the lowest level in over 3 months, and against the euro to 80.1 pence per euro. Experts believe that the sterling could fall up to 10% if Scotland votes to break away from the UK, due to uncertainty about what will happen to the currency. Meanwhile, a growing number of lawmakers are now pressuring Cameron to urge Queen Elizabeth II to speak out in support of the Union. Queen Elizabeth expressed a great deal of concern over the independence referendum and requested daily updates on the matter. She is in crisis talks with UK Prime Minister David Cameron. The referendum, which could make the monarch the last Queen of Scotland, was the priority in her discussions with David Cameron on his yearly visit to Balmoral. A Buckingham Palace aide has said the Queen is a unionist. If there is a yes vote, that puts us into uncharted territory constitutionally. Nothing is certain, and her being Queen of Scotland is not a given. Whether London likes it or not, Scottish independence, and in broader terms, the Scottish referendum, will turn into a blueprint for what happens next in the other parts of the United Kingdom.
NATO summit in Newport, Wales featured the largest gathering of NATO leaders in the history of the United Kingdom. David Cameron announced that the alliance will create a new joint expeditionary force of at least 10,000 troops for rapid deployment in crisis situations. The force, which will consist of several thousand ground troops with naval, air and special forces units in support, will be staffed on a rotating basis by member countries and will be ready to deploy on a few days' notice. To discuss more about NATO's new approach against Russia, I have invited prominent guests to shed more light on the issue. What is JEF standing for? And what is the nature of such a task force proposed by the British Prime Minister?
I guess that stands for Joint Expeditionary Force, which is apparently a permanent standing army of NATO, to be different from NATO expeditions that have consisted of national forces. This would be sort of displacing the idea of a permanent United Nations force, which is itself still a militarist idea, but at least in theory represents all of the nations of the world, and even in practice has the big nations of Russia and China and others able to veto things. This is a permanent military for NATO, for the NATO countries, and originating with the United Kingdom, but to include at this point Norway and Denmark and Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. There have been proposals for bases in Poland and Romania and the Baltic countries. And so the theory that Cameron has put forth is that this will uphold NATO's obligation for NATO members to protect a fellow NATO member who's attacked, as if anyone's going to attack a NATO member when NATO has 3/4 of the world's military. But he also says, David Cameron says, this will be a force that can go anywhere on Earth in 2 to 5 days. So how that's to protect NATO members is beyond me. And yet, where they're talking about putting the bases, you see where the thrust is. This is directed at Russia, not so much at the entire world or at defending NATO countries, so much as aggressively threatening and targeting Russia.
The idea behind the rapid response force that was supposedly proposed by David Cameron at the NATO summit in Wales, but which was actually approved as an idea by the Americans first, and then it was presented by Cameron as his idea, is supposedly intended to quickly respond to a crisis which might develop somewhere around Russia, along the border with its neighbors, and so that NATO could prevent, in inverted commas, an invasion by the Russian troops of independent countries in Eastern Europe.
How is such a move seen by Russia?
Of course, this is a provocation, a clear-cut provocation, because what it means is that NATO is gradually moving eastwards and surrounding Russia, and this is something that Russia was demanding that NATO would not do. So in a sense, and this is my personal opinion, I think the Cold War has never really ended. I think the Cold War would have ended if NATO would have disbanded itself, because NATO was created as a force to prevent Russia from invading Europe. Now, after we had supposedly ended the Cold War, why would such a military alliance continue to exist? It made no sense, apart obviously from the cushy jobs for NATO generals and thousands of bureaucrats sitting in Brussels and other places. So, and by this standard, the Cold War never went away. And by this standard, NATO continued to move eastwards, saying one thing to the Russians, that they're not going to expand, and doing absolutely reverse thing in reality.
Russia had been promised at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not expand eastward, and it has relentlessly expanded eastward. It is talking about making Georgia a NATO member. It is pushing to make Ukraine a NATO member. It is pushing the propaganda of a Russian invasion of Ukraine and the need for NATO military action to defend Ukraine and to make Ukraine a NATO member, despite the fact that it's not currently a NATO member, and the people, when polled in Ukraine, a strong majority are opposed to becoming a NATO member. But when you start putting a permanent military force, as well as the so-called defensive missiles right on Russia's border, you end up with a more dangerous Cold War than we had before, where the line was down the middle of Germany. Now the line is along the border of Russia. This is incredibly reckless, and NATO does not seem to be concerned. You see the NATO members standing there in Wales watching the Red Arrow jet airplanes fly over and do tricks, and they just look bloodthirsty. This is not a group making rational calculations and using force as a last resort. This is a group motivated by the thrill of militarism, and that's dangerous.
And why is Britain taking the lead of forming such a task force? Is it rooted in the bilateral relations between Britain and Russia? Mr. Nekrasov assesses the level of the relations.
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that there are two levels of relations between Britain and Russia. One is the political level, which has been deteriorating for years. And it has nothing to do with the level of business. Because as regards business, it's always been developing and growing. And companies like BP and Shell have been investing billions into Russia. And now BP is actually owns 20% of the Russian oil and gas giant Rosneft. So these are two levels. Unfortunately, the David Cameron government is under the strong influence of America. I would even say it has become even more influenced by America than Tony Blair before them and his government. And this produces some very bizarre situations. For example, when the NATO summit opened in Wales, at the same time, a judge in America ruled against BP for that oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And BP will now be forced to pay more billions and billions of dollars in compensation, even though it's not really responsible for a lot for that disaster. At the same time, Obama, who was there in Wales, and Cameron, who was escorting him everywhere, this issue wasn't even raised, even though alarm bells were ringing in BP and their share prices went down. On the other hand, the Russian government is working with BP as a partner, as a co-owner of Rosneft, and BP, by the way, is making enormous profits in Russia. So you have a very strange situation where Prime Minister Cameron is basically going against the interests of his own country and the interests of one of the biggest corporations Britain has, which pays obviously huge taxes and has investments by vast pension funds into its shares. So I think this is an example of how strange and bizarre the policies of David Cameron and his government are. Basically, they're working against their own people.
Considering the strong economic ties between the two countries, is Cameron practically sacrificing Britain's interests to America's wish? Should Cameron's main concern be Russia?
Well, it's obvious that with the sanctions that have been introduced by the European Union against Russia, Britain's links, economic links with Russia will suffer. And that is another point which is quite strange, because why would Britain be interested in suffering, basically, from introducing its sanctions when it's America that is playing its games, when it's America that is pressing Europe to impose sanctions on Russia and basically suffer for that?
Well, I was at the NATO summit a couple of years ago in Chicago, and there were huge protests, and in Wales there were huge protests, and it's necessary to spend some $80 million just to protect these people for a few days from the populace that they ought to be representing. So this is a very anti-democratic, anti-populist agenda of militarism that in moments of high fear and propaganda you can get people to go along with, get people angry at beheadings and throat slittings, but by and large the people represented by the NATO leaders do not share NATO's agenda, do not want a further militarized world. And by all reasonable standards, I think NATO has lost any rational purpose and ought to be disbanded, and we would be safer rather than endangered if NATO were eliminated.
By the way, it is against Britain's national interests, and it is against international norms.
It removes military decisions a further step from the people of France and Germany and Britain and so forth. And that's one of the dangers, aside from the blatant illegality of proposing to go and fight wars anywhere on Earth in 2 to 5 days, which even if you accept the UN's right to go and do that, this is outside of the UN, and these are countries that are members of the UN Charter, but are proposing to continue to blatantly violate it.
Britain will contribute 3,500 personnel to the Rapid Reaction Force, Prime Minister David Cameron said. It's unclear what other contributions from other NATO members will entail. NATO also announced that its 2016 summit will be hosted by Poland, which is meant as a symbolic of the alliance's commitment to its eastern members. What is your take on all this? There's more than enough to talk about. We have the potentially epic Scottish referendum and the UK showdown with Russia. Wow, lots on Britain's plate. That's why we have to hear it from you. Our Facebook page is called UK Desk Press TV, or you could email britain@presstv.ir. The Monarchy will continue to watch Britain, so you have to continue to watch the Monarchy. We'll be back next week with a lot more. Until then, it's goodbye.
Chance away with pomp and circumstance. Come join our merry dance to the rhythm of goodbye. Farewell the jewel crown, farewell the velvet gown. Watch it all come tumbling down. Goodbye to the crown. Goodbye to the crown. Goodbye to the king of nothing really. Wave of a hand and a life of Riley. What Nazi pod King Billy. Goodbye to the crown.